Welcome to Creepy Scary. Joe Edgar had been a trucker for 33 years. Working out of Georgia, he had driven through every state. When he was home, Joe enjoyed time with his wife Mary and his two boys, Sean and William. He missed his family when he was away, but he had to put food on the table. Modern technology meant he could see and speak to them every night. Podcasts, music from country to rock, and classic rap and hip-hop made the miles go by. Driving in the winter could be tough. Tonight, a huge snowstorm was going to dump right on top of him. Many drivers preferred to stay closer to home when the weather got this bad, but Joe didn't mind dealing with it. Driving at night was his favorite time. The roads were quieter and there were fewer idiots around. Eating too late in the day made him sleepy on a night drive. Instead, he took a few snacks to stop him from feeling hungry. Then around 5 a.m. he would get breakfast, often driving further if it meant eating at one of his favorite diners or truck stops. There weren't many of them left these days. Most of the mom and pop diners he loved were gone. His son Sean had a heavy cold before Joe left on this trip. Now he had it, and it was taking its toll. With the storm coming in, he changed his usual routine. It was going to be a late supper and then a few hours sleeping in the cab, taking off again around 3 a.m. Martha's Diner in Midland was on his route, one of the few of his old favorites still operating. It was now run by Martha's daughter, whom everyone called Martha, even though her name was Susan. There was also a bonus tonight. His old friend and fellow trucker Jose was going to be there, waiting for the storm to pass. Susan had known Joe and Jose for many years. They had both been to Martha's hundreds of times since she was a kid. They caught up a few times a year whenever they were passing through. When Joe arrived, the place was busy. Susan didn't work nights, but tonight it was all hands on deck. Reports of a big snowstorm coming meant a lot of drivers preferred to sit it out. Many familiar faces were there, drivers Joe saw on the road a few times a year. He knew them well enough to say hello and catch up for 5 minutes. He saw Jose at the counter, scrolling through his phone. He sneaked up beside him and made him jump. Jose was happy to see him. The two started driving together on the same day for Miller's Trucking in Georgia. They had become good friends over the years. Everyone called them the Two Joes. Susan came up and hugged them both. The three of them chatted for a while, shared some family news and talked about the weather. Jose was staying all night. He didn't feel like dealing with a storm, and the company he worked for was paying him anyway. He had already booked a room at the local motel. He suggested Joe do the same, but Joe's wife, Mary, needed a new car. He was saving every penny he could right now. After chatting for a while, Joe noticed someone sitting alone at a corner booth with a hoodie on, their head down. He asked Susan if she had noticed the person. She said it was a young girl in her early 20s. She had shown up with no money, and Susan gave her something to eat and a coffee. The road was no place for a kid to be out alone at night. Susan felt sorry for her. Her eldest daughter was the same age. Once the storm passed, Susan hoped someone could take her to wherever she was going. A couple of truckers sat down and started bothering the girl. Her head dropped further. Joe went over and told them to leave her alone. These were the sort of guys who gave his profession a bad name. One of them squared up to him. Joe could smell alcohol on the guy's breath. Jose came over to back Joe up, but it didn't escalate. Susan threw them out, telling them not to come back. They shouted a few choice words as they exited and gave her the finger. Joe asked the girl if she was okay and if she needed anything. She shook her head no, but said nothing. Joe's cold started kicking in. He decided he was going to get some sleep. He said goodnight to Susan and Jose and told them he would be back for a coffee before he left. He dosed up on cold and flu medicine and snuggled down for a few hours of sleep in his cab. He woke up around 3 a.m. and went back into the diner. The place was much quieter. Jose had left and was no doubt sound asleep in his motel room. The young girl was gone from the corner. Joe got a coffee and asked Susan where the girl was. She had been so busy she didn't notice her leave. They were both concerned for the girl's safety, but what could they do? It was time for Joe to leave. He gave Susan some cash and told her to pay for Jose's breakfast in the morning. The two Joes had a friendly game where they would do things for each other without the other one knowing. They scored a point whenever they did something nice. The game reset when one of them got to 10 points. Jose was 2 up, so this would claw him back a bit. The storm was still blowing, but had slowed a lot in the few hours Joe was asleep. It was early enough for him to get ahead of the other trucks and miss the local rush hour. A few miles into the drive, he saw a dark figure walking along the side of the road in the snow up ahead. He got closer and slowed down. It looked like the hoodie girl from the diner. He pulled past her off the road and opened his passenger door. She got to the truck door and stopped. He asked if she wanted a ride. She must be freezing. He promised her he was a good guy and that she would be safe. She stared into the cab. He still couldn't see her face under the hoodie. She stood there for 30 seconds before she climbed in. Before now, Joe had only ever picked up one hitchhiker, a guy who had broken down at a truck stop on the way to Nashville. It was raining and he felt sorry for him. Unfortunately, the man turned out to be an idiot who tried to rob Joe. The police said it was a scam he had pulled on other truckers. Joe didn't pick up hitchhikers after that experience. But this was a young girl out in a storm on her own. There were too many bad guys out there. It was the right thing to do. They drove for 10 minutes in silence. Joe tried to strike up a conversation, but she kept her head down and said nothing. Then she started tapping her long nails on the dashboard. It was distracting, but Joe didn't say anything. She kept on doing it non-stop. Tap, 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 tap. Half an hour into the journey, the girl stopped tapping, turned and lunged at Joe, biting his arm. She tried to grab the wheel. He elbowed her off as he fought to control the truck. It was tough in the snow, but he got it under control and pulled over. The girl spat blood all over the dash and Joe, then opened the door, jumped out and ran. She disappeared into the blackness and was gone. He closed the passenger door and sat for a few minutes. The incident shook him up. 2 hitchhikers in 33 years and both of them psychos. That was the end of him being a good guy. He pulled his first aid kit out, cleaned up his arm and stuck a bandage on the bite. He calmed down after a while and started driving again. It was lucky the girl didn't kill both of them, or someone else on the road. After driving again for 20 minutes, he saw something up ahead. Another dark figure walking along the side of the road. He slowed down again. It was the same girl, but it couldn't be. She must have hitched a ride with someone else and gotten ahead of him, although he didn't remember seeing any vehicles overtake him since she got out. The road was empty. As he slowed, she ran into the darkness again. He sped up. A few miles further, the same shadowy figure was up ahead again. It was the girl. Once again, she ran when he got close. Joe thought that the cold and flu medicine he had taken earlier must be making him hallucinate. Maybe he was allergic to it. The same thing happened 5 more times until daylight came. He phoned Jose and Susan once he got to his destination to tell them what had happened. Jose joked around and said he slipped something into Joe's coffee, but Joe made it clear he was serious. The girl was definitely there. He dropped off his cargo and rested up for a few hours. Then he began the return journey. Later that day, Susan called him. The Midland police had found the diner girl dead on the side of the road. They had arrested the 2 truckers from earlier. Some witnesses saw them picking her up. Despite his running with the girl, her death was a shock. Joe stopped off in Midland and reported what had happened to the police. They were suspicious and took samples from the blood she spat all over the cab, as well as a DNA sample from Joe. The 2 truckers were charged with the murder, but there was one thing that made no sense. According to the police report, they had killed her 2 hours before Joe picked the girl up. After analyzing the blood samples, the police found 2 sets of DNA in his cab. Joe's from the bite and the girl's, so she had been in his cab at some point. They checked his timeline, his log, and his mobile phone to pinpoint his location. They thought maybe Joe was in on it with the 2 truckers. They got statements from several people who were in Martha's, including Susan and Jose. The diner was packed at that time and plenty of witnesses saw the incident with the 2 guys. It was clear Joe's truck didn't leave until much later, after the girl had died. The conflicting evidence meant that the 2 truckers walked. Their lawyer made enough of the fact that the girl's DNA was in another truck and all over Joe. He also had a bite wound with the girl's teeth pattern on his arm. The jury couldn't convict them. During the trial, it came to light that the girl had run away from her foster parents a few years before. The family had mistreated her, and she had been on the road alone ever since. Joe, Susan, and Jose went to her funeral service in Midland. No one else showed up. After that experience, Joe stayed closer to home, delivering for local supermarkets instead of long haul. He still met up with Jose when he was home and kept in touch with Susan on social media. Since that night, many truckers have reported seeing a girl in a black hoodie walking along the same stretch of road at night. They stop to see if she's okay, and she runs off into the night. Are reports of the girl true, or just truckers telling scary stories? You'll have to decide for yourself. But if you see a shadowy figure walking along the side of the freeway near Midland at night, it may be advisable to save your good deed for another day. Driving a truck was in Ben Hart's blood. His dad took him on the road and taught him how to drive. Every trip was an adventure. Ben soon got old enough to clock up the miles and make trucker stories for his own kids. None of that prepared him for what was about to happen. Driving a big rig through the mountains is slow. Ben had driven the same route for the past 4 years. 40 minutes into the long climb up, the same thing happened every time. He would lose cell service. The problematic part of the drive was 130 miles long, and 90 of it was a dead zone. Many truckers still had CBs fitted because of these types of black spots. The promise of worldwide satellite coverage couldn't come soon enough for Ben. The glory days of CBs and convoys were long gone, warning their fellow drivers of bears and speed traps or traffic jams. That era still held a place in many of their hearts, though. The romanticism of the old days. Truckers back then seemed to be more like outlaws. Now it was all corporate. Ben's dad let him use the radio as a kid and taught him the CB codes. He sat on his lap and pretended to steer the truck. They sometimes slept in the cab, where he listened to his dad's trucker stories while he dropped off to sleep. Ben chose the handle Nebulite after his dad's company name. Winding through the mountain road, he heard a familiar voice on the CB. It was Corkscrew, a well-known wine lover Ben had chatted to over the years. They had met a few times. Corkscrew was on the same road going in the opposite direction. They planned to meet up at a truck stop at the bottom of the mountain road for breakfast. Ben had to drop off his cargo first and would meet Corkscrew on the way back. He would only be 30 minutes behind him. Corkscrew's voice faded and the CB started picking up a lot of static. Ben could hear someone speaking in a strange language. It was unlike anything he had heard before. It had a metallic ring to it. The sound got louder. Ben changed channels a few times, but the sound was on every channel. He switched it off. It was most likely the radio signals bouncing around the canyon. Then he noticed bright lights in the sky. It seemed like they were tracking him. The lights shone into the cab and lit it up. He thought it must be a chopper searching for something. He opened his window to look up and see what it was. There was no engine noise from whatever was up there, only the sound of his truck. Even over the roar of his engine, he would still be able to hear a chopper that close. As Ben continued his journey, the lights got closer and grew brighter. Then his CB came to life again, but without him touching it. This time it was louder. Turning it on and off did nothing. It kept on pumping out the same metallic voice as before. The road ahead began to twist and turn. He had driven it hundreds of times but didn't recognize this section. The CB noise became unbearable. The light shining in his eyes made it hard to see the road ahead. Ben's cargo was classified. He took over a regular run his dad used to do. The job agency gave him a full background check, and he needed level 3 clearance, whatever that is. It was always the same cargo, 40 locked and sealed metal containers. He dropped them off and did the return trip with 40 empty ones. They'd check the seals at both ends. Ben wondered what was in the boxes, but he left them alone. The pay for these jobs was too good. The money got deposited into his account an hour after he dropped the cargo off. The boxes had the letters SIA stamped on them. A Google search for the SIA brought up nothing. An AI search said it was the Spectral Intelligence Agency, but there weren't many details. He didn't remember his dad ever mentioning who they were. As long as the checks cleared, it didn't matter. Being up in the mountains and cut off from all communication was not an ideal situation. The classified cargo made him worry about who was tracking him. His instructions were to not stop or let anyone else travel with him. One straight run. He couldn't tell anyone about the cargo and had to protect it at all costs. The light was making it almost impossible to drive. There were no truck stops up in the mountains. Ben knew of a logging road that he had used to pick up lumber a few years ago. He made a detour. The crew up there were always friendly. They also had satellite phones that worked anywhere. It was his best bet to protect the cargo. It's tough to hide a huge truck on an open road. He took the back road and the lights followed him. Cover from the trees and dense forest helped him see better through the lights. The road narrowed and he had to slow down. The voices on the CB turned into screams. The lights cleared. Ben looked up again to see where they were. They were gone, and it was pitch black again. As he came up over the hill, the blinding lights struck him in the eyes. It looked like another truck for a split second. He braked hard but smashed into it. His head hit the windshield and he blacked out. When Ben came round, he was in his cab, slumped over the steering wheel. His truck was sitting on the side of the mountain road with the engine running. There were sirens in the distance. Then blue lights came up behind him. They shot past at speed and kept going. He got out and checked his truck using a flashlight. It looked okay. There was no damage and the cargo was fine. Unsure of what had happened, he started driving again. He thought he must have blacked out at the wheel. The CB crackled, but there were no more metallic voices. The lights in the sky were gone. When he got to the drop-off facility, he didn't mention the event to anyone. They rarely spoke to him anyway. Ben stayed in the cab while they unloaded the cargo. Same as usual. Once they had finished and loaded the empty cases, they waved him off. Corkscrew was waiting at the truck stop when Ben got there. Despite his detour up the logging road, no extra time had passed. That made things even more confusing. Did he even drive up the logging road? He wasn't sure. There was a non-disclosure clause in his contract, but he had to share what had happened with someone. Corkscrew was sure Ben had blacked out or fallen asleep at the wheel. He had a bruise on his forehead. Hitting the windshield must have knocked him out. Another truck's lights blinded him and he hit the brakes too hard. They finished their breakfast and got back on the road. For a while, Ben thought about giving up the SIA job. The money was too good. The next few runs went smoothly, so he put the experience behind him and kept the job. To date, nothing like that has ever happened again. His cell phone still doesn't work on the same stretch of road. The CB fills in the gaps like it did before. Even though everything went back to normal, Ben thought about the incident every time he drove through the mountains. He concluded that there was no other explanation. He must have fallen asleep and hit his head. What else could it be?
Want even more scares? Then check out this next video. Also, don't forget to subscribe.